I am frequently inundated with comments regarding how we as Freemasons have taken oaths that, if our personal religious beliefs are Christian, may constitute a violation of a commandment. Often referenced are selectively chosen verses, such as Matthew 5:34. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God. Similar cherry-picked verses are also commonly cited, including the latter part of Matthew 5, verse 37. All you need to say is yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. In Freemasonry, we employ the term obligation to describe the solemn promise we make. And when confronted with claims that these are oaths, our defense pivots to terminology, asserting that an obligation is not an oath. While this distinction has merit, we must acknowledge that in reality, whether we refer to it as an obligation, an oath, or something else entirely, public perception generally equates them as the same. I have found that many critics overlook three key aspects of Masonic obligations that actually prove their alignment with biblical principles. So in this edition of Daily Masonic Progress, we will explore the differences between an oath and an obligation, examine how biblical figures used oaths, and reveal how our ceremonies uphold rather than contradict these biblical teachings. And by the end, you will understand why Masonic obligations are not only biblically compliant, but also how they exemplify biblical principles that respects both the spiritual truth and practical commitment. Let's begin by understanding what an oath is, as this is going to enhance our appreciation of its relationship to obligations. One major misunderstanding regarding Masonic obligations arises from a failure to recognize the distinct elements that define each concept. Many critics and even some Masons view obligations, oaths, vows, and promises as separate entities, while others conflate them as identical. Both perspectives overlook the essential understanding of how they are interrelated. And this confusion obscures the true nature of what we're doing when we take a Masonic obligation. You see, without the clear comprehension of how these elements fuse, we cannot effectively defend or elucidate our practices. And this leaves us vulnerable to criticism and generates doubt both within our own minds and in the minds of potential candidates for Freemasonry who may worry about reconciling their own religious beliefs. What we need to consider is that oaths, vows, and promises are essentially the same thing and are somewhat interchangeable. Each represent a statement of truth concerning your reliability and character in relation to a particular matter. For us as Freemasons, these declarations signify that you possess the same moral standards and integrity required for trustworthiness. However, there are specific differences between them. And here are the distinct definitions that help us identify which of these three elements forms part of our Masonic obligation. First, promises. Well, these are declarations that are made to another person, and they're binding the promiser in honor, conscience, or law to do or refrain from doing something, which gives the promisee the right to demand enforcement and fulfillment of the promise. Vows are promises made to God or a deity pertaining to actions to be taken after certain events occur. For example, in wedding vows, they involve promises that follow a specific event or condition being met, and one will fulfill the commitments such as continuing to love your spouse. Vows are solemn promises of love and fidelity in a moral and religious context, and invoke God as a witness to your sincerity. The violation of a vow is considered a grave offense. And then there are oaths. And oaths are solemn declarations, or they can be affirmations, with an appeal to God as a witness to the truth of the declaration. If the truth of the declaration constitutes a promise, failing to fulfill that promise subjects the individual to God's judgment. And reflecting on your own obligation, you should recognize that it encompasses all three of these components: a promise, a vow, and an oath. Masonic ritual is correct in using the term obligation, but there is one distinction that elevates it to an obligation rather than a simple oath. What sets our solemn promises in Freemasonry apart as an obligation is the binding force or duty to uphold the oath, and the promise, while obligations do entail moral, civil, and religious duties, they're not actually legally enforceable, such as you can't be imprisoned or have to pay a fine. Instead, they carry one significant condition. You see, unlike a standard oath, which holds one accountable to God for any violation, an obligation introduces accountability in the form of a penalty for non-fulfillment. If such a penalty were legally enforceable, it would then constitute a contract. However, as it's not, the penalty is just moral perjury. In essence, it signifies that you're not the person you claim to be, that you're a liar, and you cannot be trusted. Now that we understand what distinguishes our obligations from simple oaths, we must address an even more fundamental question. Are these obligations, which we now recognize contain oaths, biblically permissible in the first place? You see, another common challenge we as Freemasons face comes from those who claim that any form of oath-taking is explicitly prohibited by Scripture. And these critics often cite Jesus' words about not taking oaths at all, seemingly creating an insurmountable biblical barrier to any Masonic practice. And this represents one of the most serious challenges that we encounter, as it strikes at the very heart of our ceremony for any brother who holds Christian beliefs. So we as Freemasons, we take obligations, but the reality is that everyone takes oaths, makes promises, or takes vows. Oaths are taken in court, and public officials may take an oath of office. Even religious leaders take oaths, such as the papal coronation oath, or the oath of canonical obedience that's taken by clergy members upon their ordination, or the oath taken during the licensing of a bishop in a diocese. And if these critics are correct, it would imply that countless faithful Christians, including clergy members and religious leaders who have been unknowingly violating biblical law throughout the various oaths of office and service that they take in public and civil life. Are these then biblically illegal? Well, as many argue, given that Jesus' command in Matthew 5:34, "But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God." Well, the theology behind this specific command is the scribes and Pharisees were making oaths that they didn't intend to keep, while ignoring others when it suited them. And they often included many caveats. For example, they would swear by the temple, but they were only bound by the oath by the gold of the temple. And Jesus condemns such hypocrites for finding convenient excuses to lie or even renege on their promises when they wished. He further asserts that one cannot swear on something of God's to convince another of the truth, such as saying, "I swear on the sky being blue," a claim of truth reliant on voluntary oaths. And when Jesus commands that your yes be yes and your no be no, he's emphasizing the importance of integrity and honesty, so that every promise, remember, an oath is a promise, and your word should stand on its own merits, rather than depending on something else being true or on the risk of something else being a consequence if you fail to uphold the truth. In the example I gave before of "I swear on the sky being blue," what you imply is that if the sky changes color, you've lied or you've broken your oath or promise. Hence, if the sky turned red, it would suggest that you had indeed lied and broken your promise. Another question we must ask is Jesus condemning the taking of voluntary oaths to establish truth regarding past events, or even to affirm your reliability in circumstances where you are unknown? If you asked me, did you buy milk when you went to the shops? You should not need to then enter into a voluntary oath like, I swear on the sky being blue that I bought milk when I went to the shops. A simple yes or no should suffice, with your integrity and your honesty as a person being enough. The key difference that makes this biblically illegal is that your promise is based on the truth of something else, or penalization of another factor, such as the sky being blue or turning red, in order to create the credibility that you are telling the truth or you're going to uphold your promise. For an oath to be biblically valid and not actually violate the command, it must be made with genuine introspection. For example, in Matthew 26, verses 62 to 64, Jesus himself took an oath. And you might argue that this is the most significant oath in all of Christianity, as it was the very oath that condemned him to death and ultimately resulted in salvation for Christians. Jesus before the Sanhedrin, Matthew 26, 62 to 64. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said so," replied Jesus, "but I say to you all, from now on you'll see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." From Jesus himself. Conversely, Peter denied Jesus while under oath in Matthew 26, verses 72 to 74. He denied it again with an oath, "I don't know the man." After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know the man." Considering the oath that Jesus took at the Sanhedrin, it was aimed at ensuring the reliability of his testimony. Whilst Peter broke his oath, he nevertheless took one, which explains his lamentation over his actions. He recognized that he had committed perjury. There were also other instances of disciples taking oaths. Paul himself, under oath, calling God as his witness in Romans 1:9, or 2 Corinthians 1:23, or 1 Thessalonians 2:10. Like Jesus, when Paul took these oaths, he was establishing his credibility for the benefit of those who might doubt in his reliability. And from this, we can conclude that for an oath to be biblically compliant, it must call on God to bear witness to the truth of your testimony, be made solely for the purpose of establishing the reliability of your character, and make you accountable to God for upholding it. And here we observe that the oath component of a Masonic obligation is both biblically compliant as well as legal. But what distinguishes the solemn promise of an oath from an obligation is the duty to uphold it, and your accountability to the institution of Freemasonry for doing so. You see, failure to uphold your obligation results in the penalty of expulsion, leading to the loss of all rights and privileges of Freemasonry without the possibility of repair. And this is the Masonic equivalent of what many religious institutions would call excommunication. And while Masonic obligations align with proper biblical oath-taking, there remains one final challenge. How do we reconcile this with Jesus' command to let your yes be yes and your no be no? The final challenge we often face comes from those that insist that any oath beyond a simple yes or no violates Jesus' directive. They argue that our elaborate ceremonies and formal declarations exceed this simple requirement, rendering them unbiblical. And this criticism strikes at the heart of our ceremonial practices. If taking an obligation were to violate the principle of letting your yes be yes, it would indicate that our entire initiation process contradicts the biblical teachings. However, such a view overlooks crucial elements of our ceremonies that actually illustrate careful adherence to this principle. So in addressing this part of the challenge, we frequently look to specific components of the ceremony that precede the taking of an obligation. These involve the master of the lodge asking the candidate questions that constitute an oath, with each of those questions beginning with, do you declare? Do you seriously declare? And the mandated answer is in a simple yes or no response from the candidate. I do. I don't. Therefore, there is no violation of the command. Rather, we actually remain true to it. And a similar practice is consistently followed before taking an obligation in any ceremony that requires it. The candidate is asked in a yes or no manner if they're willing to take the obligation. However, the response is given both verbally, or it could also be given through a physical indication, such as kneeling. The key distinction is that the obligation itself does not replace one's word, but serves as a formal acknowledgement of the gravity and significance of becoming a Mason. It represents a conscious choice to uphold certain principles and behaviours that are fundamental to Freemasonry. But moreover, the obligation we undertake does not seek to establish credibility through external factors or conditional promises, which is the primary concern addressed in Matthew 5:34. Rather, it follows the biblical model demonstrated by Jesus, Paul, and others, where solemn promises are made with God as a witness to establish the reliability of character within a new community. What's noteworthy is that Masonic obligations do not attempt to circumvent or create loopholes in the biblical command. Instead, they embrace its spirit by requiring candidates to demonstrate sincerity through straightforward answers before proceeding to the formal declaration of their commitment. This dual approach, combining the simplicity mandated by Jesus with the solemnity of biblical oaths, creates a ceremony that is both spiritually sound and practically meaningful. While many critics will continue to challenge Masonic obligations, this careful examination reveals them not only to be biblically compliant, but also exemplary of the use of oaths as demonstrated in Scripture. They serve their intended purpose by establishing reliability and character while respecting both the letter and the spirit of biblical teachings regarding truth-telling and oath-taking. So when we consider the complete picture of Masonic obligations, from their distinct nature to the biblical precedent, as well as their careful implementation, we find not a contradiction of Scripture, but rather a thoughtful and reverent application of biblical principles and practice. Far from being something to defend or apologize for, our obligations stand as a model of how to combine straightforward truth-telling with solemn commitment, all while maintaining both spiritual integrity and practical significance. And these critics may continue to challenge these obligations. We have seen clear evidence of their biblical compliance through understanding the unique nature beyond simple oaths, examining the biblical precedents from Jesus and Paul themselves, and recognizing how our ceremonies fulfill rather than contradict these biblical commands. Therefore, the next time someone questions whether Masonic obligations violate biblical teachings, know how to explain why they are not only compliant, but also exemplary of proper oath-taking. For more insights into Masonic practices and their spiritual foundations, as well as making daily advancements in Masonic progress, please subscribe to Daily Masonic Progress either on the YouTube channel or the email newsletter by clicking the link in the description.